Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video I want to do a showcase on turret drone builds, and specifically two variants of them, as one is more geared towards maximizing skill haste alongside of skill damage, and the other is more towards maximizing skill damage alongside of crit chance and crit damage, and that is mostly to buff up our damage or weapon output and thereby increasing our damage a little bit more and foregoing skill haste by a lot. Both of them are pretty effective builds still. They are classics, so to say. And, well, they are not very recommended for more advanced players. They are great workhorses, and especially for players starting out and players that are less good shots, to say it bluntly. They're still quite good builds to have. As always, we'll be making use of my build collection and several build pictures from there. And this build actually as well is at quite high, well, the crit chance, crit damage variant of it. It's quite high up here towards the top as one of the two core recommended builds. And I feel that is still correct, as it is a good build to have, especially starting out and when you're learning the game. While using the build, it lets you keep more awareness, as shooting usually takes quite a lot of attention, especially for newer players. And by using a turret drone, you get to basically slow it down a little bit and keep more awareness, let your turret and drone do most of the damage, and letting you keep a bit more awareness, seeing where enemies spawn, how conflicts escalate and such. And that can be a really good learning tool, I feel. Now, as always, with my build showcases, it will be split into two chapters. In the first chapter, we'll be going over the build itself and also discussing a few of the numbers, although that's mostly, we're going to discuss some of the differences in the weapon output between the two builds for today. And in the second chapter, I'll take it into some gameplay and live narrate and give you some insights into how I play it and maybe teach you a little bit into what can be done with a build that a lot of people feel is an AFK build, which I quite strongly disagree with. So yeah, to actually jump into the build, and here's the first build we'll be discussing today. And as you can see, this build is laid around having maximizing skill damage and pairing that with skill haste. And every piece has skill damage, every piece has skill haste, and all the mods are skill haste as well. And brand-wise, this is the layout that both builds will be, is that it's 3 pieces of Empress, 2 pieces of Hana Yu, and 1 piece of Wyvern. And that layout is the classic layout for a turret drone build. There are several other ways of laying it out, especially waveform or memento as well. It can be used with turret drone builds. But for today, we'll be basically keeping it to these two builds. Brand-wise, we're choosing Empress, as we're going for the 3-piece for that skill efficiency, as the skill health on the first piece isn't a bad choice. It isn't great. It increases the armor or health bar of your turret and drones by 10%. The skill damage is our primary stat we're going for, but especially skill efficiency, just to explain what that is, as some people do not know. Skill efficiency is all 6 yellow attributes rolled into one stat. So every percent of skill efficiency is 1% of skill damage, skill haste, status effect, skill duration, skill health, and repair skill. So it is actually quite a strong stat, because 10% of this is 10% into everything of those. So it's 10% of skill damage and skill haste, especially for us, is also 10% skill duration, which helps a little. It's an extra 10% skill health, so that helps us as well a little bit. And status effect and repair skills we're not using really. And this stat has very few sources. It's basically third piece of Empress and Memento are the 2 really effective sources of it. So we really do want to have that. That is the important one. That's the one we would not give up usually. So even if you choose to, for instance, go waveform, you would do it with either the second piece of Hana U, which is 10% skill damage, or with the Wyvern. Now, just to discuss the waveform a little bit, and the waveform, if you do not know, is the exotic holster that is quite often used, especially with third drone builds. I do not really recommend it, as while it is effective and calculation-wise it ends up on 15% skill damage, where Wyvern, of course, is 10% on average. In general play, I find that that doesn't work out, as especially if it's applying towards a drone that is on cooldown or a turret that is on cooldown. In general play, it just doesn't add up to be that 15%. And I would rather just have 10% active on both skills at all times instead of a 30%, which this is. It moves from one skill to the other over a 30-second period. It just crosses over between them, applying to one skill, then slowly working its way to applying to the other skill, and then goes back and forth like that. And that means that it just needs to be on on the wrong skill, on a drone that has been destroyed or something a few times in a mission or something, before it actually, that increase, that 15%, that theoretical 15%, becomes less than it. And also, there is a difference between the damage output of the turret and the drone. And to me, the turret is especially the primary damage dealer of this build. The drone is more of a harasser and more of a the skill that you can use to send over to something that is hiding or something, but it isn't the primary damage dealer. There's quite a damage difference between a turret and a drone. And a well-placed turret will outdamage a drone by quite a lot. So that is my opinion on the waveform. But I will concede that the difference between the two in actual play is minimal, going to be truly minimal. But I lean towards the way the not using a waveform for the reasons I stated. As yet, that just proceeding that discussion, because in both builds I will not be using a waveform. And yeah, so the 3-piece Hana U, or 2-piece Hana U, 3-piece Empress, and 1-piece Wyvern is the layout that both of the builds will be. And yeah, for the Hana U, we're going to get for that second piece, which has skill damage, and the Wyvern, of course, is first piece skill damage. And we're trying to maximize our skill damage, especially on both builds. Our turret and our drone, and just to jump over to the skills, are our primary damage dealers. And that's also going to be just the case. We are basically going to hide behind them. We're going to use them to maximize our damage. On this build, which is more leaning towards skill haste, our weapon is actually very ineffective. On the other one, it is a little bit more effective, and I'll bring up both build pictures up in a second. Firstly, I just want to discuss as well, so we're going for backpack talent of perfect combined arms. The other option here as well is to have tech support. Perfect combined arms is a little bit more active, where you have to shoot enemies, and it is a very short buff of 3 seconds, so you have to be continuously shooting enemies to keep it up. Where tech support is reliant on skill kills to be active for quite a bit after each skill kill. So for both of the builds, I'll be going with perfect combined arms. It is my preference, as I usually can keep shooting, especially with a turret and a drone. They'll take aggro away from you if you're doing it right. So you should be able to keep shooting, especially on heroic. Maybe a little bit less so on legendary, but for the constraints of today's video, I'll also mostly be sticking to heroic. The chest talent on this one, especially this one where we aren't going that much for our weapon damage, is kinetic momentum. And kinetic momentum applies to skills that can be deployed. So kinetic momentum doesn't work well with any skill that doesn't deploy, such as stickies or chems. So, but for the turret and drone, it works quite well, and it is stacking. Once you deploy a skill, it starts to stack up, and when both skills are active for 15 seconds each, then they give you a total of 30 total skill damage. And total skill damage, especially just to reiterate, is just with total weapon damage, is a separate multiplier. So both of the chest and the backpack talent here provide us with total skill damage, which is a different multiplier than skill damage itself. So these are quite strong and very powerful to increase your output. Now, for the other build, I'll be using glass, and once we discuss that, I will explain why glass is the other option. But glass is actually not the choice I would use for a generalist third drone build, as of course it comes with a downside. Now, weapon-wise, I quite strongly feel that the capacitor is the real choice, especially for the other variant, as the output of the capacitor is unmatched, really, versus most of the other choices that you can have here, because the other choice, especially, is to have perfect in sync on the AR that can have perfect in sync, but the capacitor reconstitutes more weapon damage and has it always active, even if your skills are offline. It can stack up to 60 skill damage, where InSync stacks up to 40. But of course, InSync is really easy to apply, where this, of course, you have to stack up a little bit. But usually that isn't hard to do. So I feel quite strongly that the capacitor works quite well for that, especially alongside the fact that it has 10 crit chance, which you could, of course, have with 2 mods on the Perfect InSync AR as well. But then alongside of that, it has 30 crit damage, even though it only has 10 extra rounds, where you could have a Big Mag on the Perfect InSync AR and have 20 rounds. But I feel that the capacitor is my preference. If you're willing to try both and see which one you feel stronger about. Alongside that, though, I would say that the Harmony, even though this is a PvP/DZ item, so it may take some time to get it. Usually from named caches is where most people will get them from, or you can farm the DZ, or get them from DZ vendors as well, of course. And that's mostly because, well, Perfect InSync works well, but it is very much a secondary in this case. I will only really use it once I run out of capacitor ammo, which from time to time does happen, of course. For tertiary, for the pistol, I do recommend having a Future Perfect weapon, either as your secondary or as on the pistol slot, as sometimes you can sneak in a Future Perfect and overcharge yourself for 15 seconds and increase your output by quite a lot, as both the turret and the drone gain a lot from Future Perfect. Now, with Technician, for our specialization, Technician is really the only choice. Technician first gives us the ability to get that extra 10 skill damage that it has as a choice, where you can choose between skill damage or repair skills. And I personally, basically, on all my characters, have it set to skill damage, and I basically never change that, even when I'm a full healer or anything. Alongside of that, it has other benefits as well, where especially Faraday can be the Faraday effect, where if you're close to your skills, and that will make you immune to shock and disrupt, can be used quite effectively with your turret to keep yourself undisrupted in cases where you would get disrupted. And of course, jamming, being disrupted, is one of the banes of all skill builds, and especially third drones will suffer from it as well. And also what the specialization of Technician allows us to have is that we get one skill tier from our specialization, so we can have one skill tier or one core on one of our gear pieces recore to something else. Now, in this case, of course, I've chosen weapon damage, as that's what I usually tend to, but you could also just take a little bit more armor. In both cases, it's a minor upgrade, but it helps a little bit. So yeah, do try to find one piece that you recore, and that will be apparent on both builds as well. Now, having discussed this build a little bit, let me actually bring up its build picture a little bit. Bring it up here. And one thing that I briefly just want to discuss is, yeah, that we do land, especially with the capacitor, on a decent enough weapon damage and assault rifle. Especially with this build, of course, we are giving up quite a lot on our crit chance and crit damage. It is quite low. This is basically base stats together with just the capacitor. But here is what all that skill haste gains us, is that we do have it on 10 seconds for basically both skills. One is a little bit below, the other is a little bit above. And that lets you get out your skills a lot faster, which can be quite useful, especially starting out. But especially what this build is very much for me is also my test bed for testing skills. And going skill haste, what I feel is what makes it a valid choice is if you also use it to try out all the other skills. Now, especially kinetic momentum may not be the right choice for some skills that you could use, stuff like chem or explosive stickies or stuff like that, stuff that doesn't deploy. But you can still play around a little bit with other skills, because most other skills outside of the turrets and the drone do require quite an investment in skill haste to have good uptime. Where the turret and the drone, especially now if we jump over to the other build, so keep in mind that on this build we're basically hovering around 10 seconds for our skill haste, with all of our skill haste for our cooldown of our turret and drone. And if you go over to the other build, as you can see here, it's all skill damages alongside a red stats. In this case, crit chance or crit damage. And giving up all of the skill haste that we had, so we only have the skill haste basically from our watch on this build. It's only still 17, well, close to 18 seconds on basically both skills. So all of that skill haste on the other one, on the turret and the drone, is only gaining us only 8 seconds of cooldown basically. And that's why I quite strongly feel that if you're choosing to go just for a turret and drone, and you basically know that you're not going to use this build for other skills, so for instance, you make a hardwired build for explosive or something, or dedicated explosive builds for explosives or such, then I would say it's a better choice to go this route where you just stack up on crit chance and crit damage. And as you can see, it does get up to a really respectable 56 crit chance and 111 crit damage. And that does bump up the damage values of the output by quite a lot. So if we actually just weapon-wise, if I jump back to the other one, I have the output numbers for body shot crits in the bottom left here with 127k and 222k. And if we jump over to the other one, we will see that it's 144k and 305k. So it is quite an increase. And part of that also as well comes from, on this build, I'm going with glass cannon. And in this case especially, I'm going glass cannon because glass cannon will apply both to my turret and my drone and to my weapon, to my primary weapon. And that makes glass quite useful for this kind of build. Where kinetic momentum on the other one, we're mostly concerned about our output on the turret and the drone. Here, because we're also outputting quite a lot with our weapon, or we're trying to output a lot with our weapon, then glass cannon becomes the obvious choice. But of course, glass cannon comes with its own downsides. Now, you could also go perfect glass cannon here, and the difference between the two is actually minimal, as skill damage is very much diminished at this point, so that 5% extra from skill damage can be, or from the increase from glass to perfect glass, basically matches up together. In this case, I've gone for a wyvern chest with just glass cannon. For the rest on this build as well, it is basically the same output. As you can see, it is the same turret and the drone. It is that same 3 pieces of Empress, 1 piece Wyvern, 2 piece Hanu. And layout-wise, in especially this one, I could not actually go waveform, Although I've specifically chosen here as, again, one piece is recore to a red core, especially with with this build to a red core specifically, of course, because it is more geared towards that. And I've done that on the holster, even though I would, so I could swap this to the waveform if I wanted to use different skills. But honestly, I likely would not. This very much in this layout becomes a dedicated third drone build, where the other one can actually be used to play around with many different skills. One thing of note as well is that in the game, I have different expertise grades on my turret and drone than I have on these pictures. So some of the numbers will jump around a little bit. As you can see, this is 70 weapon damage, of course. On the other build, which is basically the same, all weapon damage bonus outputs layout, it is 90, and that is down to having that expertise or grade 20 capacitor. Also, my turret and my drone, well, in these pictures are, and with the stats that they have here, are actually without grading. On both my accounts, I have them graded to 20, so their output is actually quite increased from here. And it may skew a little bit how they look in their output when we go into gameplay. So do keep that in mind a little bit. In my case, it's basically maxed out. So until you reach that point as well, it's going to be a little bit less, but a little bit. Yeah, let's actually hop on over to some of the numbers for this, and we're basically going to discuss some of the weapon output numbers especially. So let's jump over to that. And here's the sheet that I've prepared for today. I've mostly reconstituted actually the sheet that I've used for the turret drone negotiator. I've made a copy of it and added in these two builds, and also together with one of them being a grade 20 variant. And if you haven't seen these sheets before, and they may seem a little bit daunting at first, I do have a video up on my channel actually where I go through and explain how these work if you're interested to that level. Otherwise, the thing to know is that this is basically comparing 10 rows of builds, and the 10 rows upstairs get our output from the input in the 10 rows below, and they're color coded to match. So if you look at it for a few seconds, usually it's easy to somewhat understand. And the thing to understand as well is in this columns, the builds are all comparing to the build in the top slot. So in this case, we're all comparing to this glass vigilance red. And I always use these three: glass vigilance red, obliterated vigilance red, and unbreakable vigilance red as my comparison points, as I know them quite well as builds and what their output is. At the bottom as well, we still have a striker obliterate variant at full stacks. So not completely from its first shot, of course, but just as a comparison point. And in between, we have the third drone negotiator as the green in between, which isn't the build that I'm showing here today. And the two builds that I'm showing here today is actually this third drone SD plus SH, which is the skill damage plus skill haste, and then skill damage plus crit chance crit damage as this orange shade inputs. And alongside of that, I also have the second one together with a grade 20 weapon. So the difference is an extra 20 weapon damage as you would gain from a grade 20 weapon, just to also know the difference between being a grade 0 with the weapon and grade 20 with the weapon, as that will be the case for today when we reach that build in gameplay. Now we can see here, if we start on the skill damage, skill haste variant, you can see that of a glass red, so a pretty strong red build, of course, that is nothing to scoff at. Glass reds, even though striker, of course, in output is quite a lot higher, a glass red is still, it's the old top dog. We can see that the skill haste skill damage variant in its weapon output alone is basically, well, 15% of the burst output, and a little bit more, 16.5% of the sustained output of a glass thread. And that is basically what happens when you take a build that is mostly yellow cores, does not have much crit chance, crit damage, and then also a capacitor is not the best weapon as compared to, for instance, in this case, what it's compared to with that build is a FAMAS with a talent. I'm also basically simulating a weapon talent with this extra 10% amp, even though no talent is so much specifically 10% really, but it's a midway point between strain, which is going to be like 8.5%, 9% on that build, and for instance, either having stuff like flatline, but then it would also lose 5 crit chance. So I'm just condensing that to just say it's gaining an extra 10% because, of course, the capacitor is already locked in and will not have an extra talent. Its talent is already providing its buffs in weapon damage. And that is quite low. And of course, it makes up for that because it has quite a lot of damage on its turrets and its drones, is of course not going to catch up to a glass red. And in general as well, turret drone builds like this that don't have really high weapon damage output aren't that high just output dealers, because the turret and the drone will basically, together with you shooting as much as you can, will maybe bring you to half of glass red together. Maybe close to an unbreakable vigilance red, but a normal red can of course be a lot stronger in its output. But what the turret and drone make up for it with is that they are easier to play, of course. You can send your turret and drone after stuff. You're a lot safer. They can take aggro away from you, and you can hide behind them and keep awareness. And for some people, especially if you're not as good of a shot, then why not use turret and drones that will be equalizers between all players, basically. And still as well, for legendary, there is a case to be made to run them with turret and drones for your first few times, especially to get a feel for them, to see where the spawns happen, as they can be a lot more consistent, I feel, than running through them with red builds. Although, especially Striker with its high output has taken that spot away as well a little bit, as it has just such a high output that it increases the consistency that people will get through legendary with. Now, if we move on to the crit chance, crit damage variant, we can see that we have increased our burst and our sustain by quite a lot. And here actually this 182% is the difference between the burst of the skill haste variant versus the crit chance, crit damage variant. So it's this sustain number divided by the sustain number of the skill haste variant, and that's 183%. So we're getting close to doubling out the weapon damage output. Now, of course, the weapon damage output itself was not that high to begin with, so in absolute terms, it's not that big of an increase, of course. But going from that, the sustain number of basically 850k to this sustain number of 1.5 mil is considerable, and you will feel the difference between the two as you get to kill stuff with your weapon suddenly. Especially when we also then add in a grade 20 weapon. As you can see here, we're adding, because it's mostly a yellow core build, of course, and has pretty low weapon damage with 70 on the normal build, that we take to 90 with grade 20, we gain 11.75%. So we gain close to 12% output just by going to grade 20. So especially with builds that are low on weapon damage, we gain a lot more from expertise grades than we do on, for instance, a full red. Full-blooded red that will usually have 140 weapon damage and then goes to 160 with the expertise. Here, because we're going from 70 to 90, our absolute increase is a lot better. But then, yeah, when we compare it to, for instance, yeah, Striker Obliterate leaves it in the dust, and together with its turret and drone, it will not catch up. I would say that and this is more of a guesstimate on my part, that the crit chance, crit damage variant, together with its turret and drone, if you're using them quite effectively, does about the same together, with the weapon and the turret and drone together, as maybe an Unbreakable Vigilance threat. And that's, of course, a lot lower already than a glass threat, and a lot lower than a striker. But it still has value because it provides you with a little bit more safety. And also, this build is a lot easier to put together than most red builds, with the sole exception for maybe the strikers build, even though that does require a good FAMAS and a good Seska chest. The nice thing about turret drone builds is that the capacitor, especially, which is the main weapon, is easy to get. All of the pieces are yellow core, or well, except one are yellow cores, and that makes them really easier to farm, as basically you have one stat less. And the turret and drone as well don't lose as much from being at 0 watch points in comparison to a player that has their watch full. Basically, in difference, you are only losing the skill haste and the skill damage. So output-wise, sorting out, it isn't a horrible choice to go for a turret drone build, especially because, yeah, that main weapon is so easy to get, the pieces are easy to get, you already have a turret and a drone, and you can basically get one together pretty quickly. So yeah, let's take the skill haste skill damage variant, starting out into some content, and then we will also take the crit chance, crit damage, and I will discuss them further. Here I'm heading into Toxic Alley CP, also known as General Chat when patch gets delayed, as we had today to date this video. I've chosen this one because on the defense we're going to have enemies from both sides, so I will have to relocate likely, unless we are lucky and everybody spawns from one side. So one thing that, especially with turret drone, is important is the placement of your turret. So normally here, one thing you could do is just double tap the turret button, and that will just place your turret on the cover that you're up against. And usually what I do is then move a few meters to one side just to get a little bit of separation between me and my turret, just in case when grenades or something goes towards my turret, as for instance there somewhat, then yeah, it doesn't also hit me. So one thing too is important, that you usually try to keep your turret and your drone, so especially on this build, I'm very much reliant on my turret and my drone. And that means that I should try to keep them firing at all times. So when for instance, you will quite often have your turret and your drone come back to you after fighting. And one thing that's important as well with the drone is to keep a little bit of an eye on it. And basically, before it comes all the way back to you, if you can target it onto something else, usually you can very much increase your output by doing that. And my weapon here especially feels very weak, and as I've maybe shown with other build showcases, and especially just doing turret drone hybrids before even doing the normal turret drone, of course, I very much prefer those, as I'm a decent enough shot. I'm not great or anything, but I can do the shooting part. But that isn't the case for everyone. And that's one of the good ways to make use of turret drone builds. For instance, I, in my personal friends list, have players that are older. They're not as good as shooting as others. And it's not even a slight against them. They know it. They are not as trained gamers as some others. And for those kind of players, it very much makes sense to go turret drone build. as you can still, there is still strategy there. You can still improve with it. Getting the most out of a turret drone build, there is some skill to it, but you're not as reliant on how good your aim is. Now here's, well, I'm doing this on 4 directives and feeling the sting of it a little bit, as I've already armor broken twice, and that's the 3rd time. So I've used 3 armor kits already. But also I wanted to show here that especially this skill haste variant does deal quite well with... I'm going to clear up that armor break just to not keep stacking up armor breaks. Should have grabbed ammo, which I'm going to do, and I'm going to go straight through those banisters because they, despite what you believe, they are very much not real. Now here, we're likely going to have to defend from either one side or the other. They can come from either the alley in front of me or the alley in the back, so that's why I basically picked this one. So I will likely need to relocate at least a few times. So what I usually do is have a look where they're spawning. You can usually, if you don't see them running out from there, then they're on the other side. And one thing I did here as well is not call in my allies right away. And that lets me have a break in between combat. That lets me basically make what was 1 fight into 2 fights. I'm going to just shoot that fire because otherwise it will likely get hit by something and kill me. Or, well, at least harm me. Now, we're going to get a second wave. I'm going to keep an eye if it's coming from the same side. It isn't. I'm going to move my drone to kill that target, and I'm going to relocate. Because, yeah, they are coming from this side. And this is what the skill haste variant can do more effectively than the other one. With the other one, you have to be a lot more cognizant of where you're placing your turret and your drone. And, for instance, especially this CP, I felt, is not one that has a good place where you can put your turret where it can engage both sides. So, in this case, it is a little... This one does have a little bit of advantage. But I still feel that I would honestly prefer to have a little bit more weapon damage on my own. But yeah, that's again, I'm confident in that I can make effective use of that. And that just doesn't need to be the case always. Starting out for players or even, you know, the younger siblings who've quite often taken, you know, quite young siblings of friends or even spouses that aren't really gamers, but you know, want to hang out, want to help out, then yeah, turret drone builds do make sense for that. They have a time and a place. But I would reiterate that personally I would feel that if you're going for a turret drone build and you are a capable player, I would go for the crit chance crit damage version. And that may be a bit more apparent as, for instance, I also did not really want to take this build into missions, as it is quite weak for that. And I don't want to be a burden to others. So I will do missions with the other one where I feel it is strong enough to be reliable enough to help along in missions, especially when they are not very hard missions. Although I haven't really picked where we are heading, of course, with that. I'll just random matchmake for that. So with that one CP here, I'm going to pause the recording a little bit here and pick a second CP just to also just discuss this a little bit more.
Hostiles guarding location.
So here I'm heading into Fallen Cranes, one of the very first CPs of the game. And I just wanted to also briefly here discuss the importance of turret placement, as quite a lot of people just put it on their cover, or some people even throw it on the ground quite often. What I would really recommend is to think about where you could put your turret. And for instance, here I can put it on this lamppost, and it's going to be elevated over all the enemies. It can likely even shoot most of them in cover. Anything that comes towards me is going to be engaged by it. So I am going to put my turret there. There was even an extra patrol here, and yeah, cool skills is still active. So normally I could even just there wait till I actually do have my drone. But of course as well, my drone is just 10 seconds away, and we can just engage out. And here as well, I'm going to make sure that, yeah, the minigun never really engages me. Like that's the dangerous target. And I'm going to try to make sure that especially my turret and my drone are always targeting something. And especially that my drone isn't coming back to me. And that in itself is actually, yeah, something that you can have an impact on. Make sure that not letting your drone come all the way back to you can make quite a difference in your output. As you can see, I basically keep an eye on it whenever its current target is close to dead. I'm already basically choosing to focus on getting it a new target. And what I also usually will want to do is try to have my turret and my drone on different targets. So have my drone on pushing things out, and have my turret taking off things that I can shoot at. The drone can be a great harasser, and the turret can be the great damage dealer. That's usually basically what the two of them together are very effective as. And here especially as well, so it's turning those enemies because my drone is there, they're focusing it, trying to focus it down, and they're basically turning their backs towards me and letting me quite easily kill them. And now, of course, here I am with a turret and drone that are grade 20. I'm with the capacitor that is grade 20. That does, and I'm of course full watch points as well. That does, of course, make this, I'm a little bit more just effective from stat-wise over a completely new player. But still, it is more than enough. A normal drone is more than enough for most of the player base to do heroic CPs, especially and stuff solo. Like, it works quite well. Here as well, we've engaged some stuff up there, but I'm actually not that concerned. One thing I will do actually before we call my allies in, and again, I've split this up into 2 fights just for easiness. I'm going to put my turret quite far forward so that it's going to aggro a lot of stuff. I'm going to wait for my drone to come off cooldown, and then I'm going to call it.
Reinforcements en route.
And I'm going to grab ammo as well, because I see that now that I'm very low on rounds. And there's the downside as well. I'm basically a pea shooter. So myself, my turret and my drone can deal decent damage, but I cannot really. And one of the downsides, especially, so what I feel very restricted by when I play, especially this build in the setup that it is now, in the skill haste variant, where my weapon barely does anything. I only basically have 1 red core for it, and that's my entire bonus towards it for my gear. Is that it feels there, for instance, I had to hit a few dozen rounds almost on that weak point before it destroyed the weak point. Whereas, yeah, of course, a red build would just be a few shots. And it can be quite frustrating when you don't get that explosive hugger before it explosive hugs your face. And that can be frustrating. But this is just also just to show, like, I'm on 4 directives heroic. I'm not really struggling or anything. And there is a little bit of easiness for me too as well. For instance, if I was a new player, doing it this way, it becomes quite clear where they're spawning, because I can pay attention to that. I don't have to focus my attention to what I'm trying to kill. Now here as well, I'm trying to split up where my turret and my drone are going after. And just trying to kill. Now here as well, weapon-wise, I'm way outside of my optimal. Although I'm also fine with that, because I'm playing it as well safe. I don't want to get many armor breaks. my turret and my drone will kill them. One thing I do want to do is, of course, keep my capacitor stacks up, so just hits will already do that. And you don't have to overdo it to keep that up. So it's better to, take it. And that's the ideology basically for drone builds, is you do it slowly, but you do it safe.
Detected.
And that's also why usually I call this slow boating, as that's what it basically is. It's not the fast ship, just it's not the speedboat, but it's just a tugboat tugging along. But it is quite strong. It can do what is needed of it. It can pull good weight. I'm just gonna see what I get from loot here, and nothing worth keeping really. And let's hop on over to the crit chance, crit damage variant, and we'll take that into a mission. But first we'll briefly discuss it. And here we are back on my main account with the other build, the crit chance, crit damage variant. And as you can see, not much has changed, except that all of those skill hastes that the other build had are basically replaced with crit chances or crit damages. And altogether, I have gone for a crit chance of 56 and a crit damage of 111. And that is a balanced crit chance, crit damage for this build. Now, of course, all of those losses of skill haste have increased our cooldowns of the turret and the drone, so you have to be a lot more aware of where you put your turret, especially. You cannot relocate it as easily as the other build could, and also cool skills will affect this build quite a lot more than the other one, where it was only a 10-second cooldown. Here we're basically effectively doubling our cooldown. So it is noticeable. But I feel quite strongly that this build, as we saw as well with the weapon damage numbers, we're basically doubling our weapon damage output. And that helps quite a bit, I feel. I feel a lot more confident killing with this build to kill with the main weapon. So not to be as reliant on the turret and the drone. And especially here, of course, we're also swapping the chest talent from kinetic momentum over to glass cannon. And we're doing that especially because the glass cannon is amplifying all damages we deal. So it is applying both to the turret and the drone, as was kinetic momentum as well. But glass is also affecting our weapon damage, our main weapon output, where kinetic momentum was not applying to our weapon at all. But of course, that comes at the cost of all the damages we take is also amplified, and with the normal variant here with 50%. And the difference, especially on the turret and the drone, because we have the same amount of skill damage between the two builds. If I quickly bring up the build picture of first this crit chance, crit damage variant, as you can see, so if we just look at the turret hit with all of the talents up, so with perfect combined arms active as well, it's 271k per hit. And if we go to the build picture of the other build with kinetic momentum, we can see that it's 267k. So the difference between the two is quite minimal, but in the favor of glass. But of course, glass comes with that major downside. So with the other one, it makes a lot more sense to go kinetic momentum because our weapon is already weak. An extra 25% is noticeable, but it's not going to change it that much. But here, of course, with all of our crit chance and crit damage, it makes a lot more sense to have a glass cannon. In the same vein that with the turret drone hybrids, they are also quite reliant on glass cannon as well. So yeah, I'm going to matchmake this into a mission, and I will... here I've accepted the invite for Air and Space Museum, which could be an interesting mission for this. And we're at the very start as well. I'm not sure if it's invaded this week. I don't believe that is Black Tusk. My ally is frozen, which never fills me with confidence. But we're just gonna start off, and hopefully they will... they are moving now. So here I'm going to this mission isn't too bad for the build that I'm running, as there's quite a few places where we have long engagements, basically. We also have no directives up, even though, well, we are just on heroic, zero directives. And, well, other builds are just, can be faster than this by quite a lot. For learning the game and such, these do make sense, the turret and the drone. And also, again, for players that have less than perfect game, it can be a lot easier to play with turret drone. I'm going to inspect my ally in a second and see what's keeping him. He is a glass red, which works well together. And yeah, there is quite a lot of... The turret and the drone can be quite good because they can drag aggro away from allies. Especially the drone, just because it will usually get proximity on enemies. Can, you know, take away a few stragglers and make it a little bit easier for your allies. And that's also usually why it works quite well for legendary. Just less stuff shoots you, especially for the first few times. But in the end, if a good player on a turret drone build is just going to always be slower than if he was on a truly or on a red build, if they are in any way decent shots.
Figure out what they're doing here. See if you can find
Now, one thing here as well, I'm just going to... There is a secret room, and it's tied to these balloons that you see down here. I'm going to shoot that balloon. That's the first one. We're going to shoot 3 balloons, and that's going to open up a secret room, actually. That is called the secret room. I'm going to pop that chest along the way. I'm going to recycle my drone. One thing that as well to keep always in mind is that when you have a lot of these corridors that takes like 10 seconds to get through, they're all there just for your skill cooldowns, basically. So I have the availability there to recycle my drone, have a fresh one when I get up here, because it's going to take longer than the few seconds that it would take to get up here. What I'm going to do here is actually move up with my allies. I'm going to put my turret right up here and be very aggressive. And as you can see, a lot of the enemies are shooting my drone. And basically the second that, especially that glass red player hits them, he basically drags aggro away. He's doing so much more damage than my drone that he can basically pull aggro quite easily away from the drone. And yeah, that basically shows the damage difference there. I'm going to move up a little bit, and I may have overextended, but I should still be fine. Just want to put my turret a little bit more advanced, more forward, and I'm going to start working on this enemy as he's moved to the side. And yeah, the downside of glass is one shotgun, and I'm already... I'm going to just kill that turret, even though it has no owner. Just one stray shot from it would take me down.
Explosive residue.
And I'm not going to use a medpack here. I'm quite confident that I'm not going to take another hit, most likely. Now, of course, the thing with this here is that if I was on a... And it's going to feel maybe a little bit repetitive, and that was one of my concerns going into this as well, is that I'm going to reiterate quite often that it is a weaker build. And there again, I wanted to actually say that... So here's a second balloon, actually, before I continue that. So that's the second balloon down. And the thing is, yeah, it is weaker. There's no denying that. But it can be variety, and for some players, yeah, it can just be better for them to go through the game with a turret drone. But I would say, especially if you're going for the turret drone, and even if you're not going for turret drone hybrids, which are, for instance, the Negotiator, which I already have a video on, or the high-end variants, which are also quite effective. And I'm also actually even adding striker version, and those are all more aligned towards having a less skill damage, but having a lot more weapon damage. So you're giving up a lot of the turret and drone effectiveness, and you're gaining your weapon effectiveness. As most of the damage for the turret and drone actually comes from skill tiers and not for skill damage. Of course, the skill damage increases it by quite a bit and significant amount, but the main principle of the output of turret and drone actually comes from the skill tiers. And that's what most turret drone hybrids that I have in my build collection, like the Negotiator, like the high-end variants, make effective use. Here again, I'm going to recycle both my skills. I know it's going to be more than the 20 seconds that both skills will take, so I might as well recycle them and have fresh ones for this coming fight. There's a chest here that quite often gets forgotten because it's right around the corner. And I'm gonna move along with my allies. That ally is rushing in solo, which I'm just gonna wait for my ally. There's a chest back here as well, which I'm going to grab just because we shall leave no loot behind. And just gonna wait for that fire there in front of me, because I actually do want to. I'm not putting my turret out yet because I do want it to be a little bit closer than I am now, but I want it to be here. And I'm heading in here and I'm putting it down there. I'm going to kill that. I don't know if the owner is still alive. I don't want to deal with it. Owner was probably dead. That's why it self-deconstructed actually before I killed it. And I'm just gonna mostly try to put damage where I can. Keep my capacitor up as well still, of course. That's not... that importance is still there. The more I deal with my capacitor, the more I'm helping as well. And yeah, we're making together with my allies, even though two of them have pretty high armor just from their armor bars. We're doing decently. And yeah, what I keep trying to do as well is keep my turret and my drone targeted on stuff. So the drone mostly will try to come back in between targets unless it's getting fired at. And the turret might target stuff that is behind walls, is usually the concerns with those two. I'm going to move in. My ally already popped the door. That means the spawn is going to happen. I'm going to toss what I did there. And that's going to hit those guys. I'm going to put my turret here for now. There's actually a better place for it, but I wasn't confident in making it. Mostly because I'm afraid of that heavy in the background. But where I really want to have it is where I'm going to toss it now, which is up there. It's going to get the door as well in this coming fight. And that's quite important with turret and drone, especially here with a non-hybrid. Even though this could be considered a hybrid, I don't consider this the hybrids. The hybrids start with going from... This is... a yellow turret drone hybrid that has a little bit of red in it, whereas the other ones are mostly red builds that have turret drone hybrided into them. And yeah, I put my turret there for that exact purpose that it's doing there. It's taking aggro, it's doing quite well for itself. I'm going to recycle them again, even though here likely it won't be enough time because we're going to move into the next room, but it'll be fine. I'm going to check my allies. That one's going after some of proficiency likely, and the other one thinks tank builds are effective, which they're not. There's and that's the thing. Like, I would very much prefer a turret drone over an attack build, which that my ally has. Because while these aren't the top damage dealers, they're still consistent damage dealers. There's no And the turret and the drone are actually more consistent in pulling aggro. I hope one of my allies actually sees that I'm down behind them instead of all moving up, though I don't give it much chance. The other one does. Yeah. And that's sometimes the downside, of course. I am a glass, I am a full red, and that means that a few hits can quite consistently take me down. So the health gate is very much important to this build as well. So normally I would never let them get as spread out as they are now, but because we could have killed them quite easily before that, usually, if we provided a consistent front towards them, basically, if all 4 players were shooting there.
Setting a recovery team.
So
And you'll be done there.
what I'm going to do here as well is go after the last balloon. My allies have gone after all of the thing, and this is that last balloon.
They must be using it.
And as you can see as well, it tells us to go into the secret room, which I will oblige it.
System to hit the White
And
House.
there's just one weapon crate, but you know,
If you see any
leave no loot behind. So
make sure they can ever be used.
there's also a weapon crate in that back corner, and my allies are dealing well enough with over there. I'm going to send my turret over, or my drone over, and I'm going to loot this as well. Gonna put my turret there. I'm going to actually just put it on the ground just to get it out real quick. But also it's just in front of them, so it will pull a little bit of aggro. Yeah, we have reached the boss fight. And one trick that exists for this boss fight is this boss fight doesn't start until the last player goes into that this room. So one thing I'm actually going to do is actually head in already. I'm going to give them a second more. This is a 20... Oh, actually, well, that ally is went in already. So they might get pulled. But yeah, so until the 4th player is in here, and I'm going to put my turret up there. And yeah, that's that turret placement I'm talking about. I'm going to set those 2 fires off and take cover here. And in a second, I'm going to actually take cover where that flame was. I'm going to toss a grenade here. It will... the disrupt will stagger all of the reds and purples. And yeah, I'm just going to focus on just working on the enemies. Keep my turret and my drone singing. And one thing that is very much noticeable here to me is how much more damage I'm dealing. So I find quite comfortable there going after weak points. Something that I quite often do is go after weak points, as yeah, they're good CCs. And the other build just does that less well. It's harder to get the explosions going. But even here, you saw me try to go for that weak point and just didn't get it. And we're a red build, where just in 2 shots, I've taken that out. And one final crate we have here is that we can open this over here, which my ally there did. And I do want to just briefly see the damage numbers, even though the only one I'm really was in competition with was that glass red. But also he's very much a newer player. And here the damage itself is a lot more than is viable for here, even on my other ally as well. There isn't that much damage in this mission, so it bugged out somewhere. But just from the kills, even though the other 2 of course joins a little bit late, I did fine. And I was a decent addition to the team. So I'm going to hop us on over into our conclusion. And to conclude this video, I feel that at points I have praised this build, and at points I have trashed it a little bit. And that is, yeah, very much what I feel about classic turret drone builds. They work well enough, but especially for players that are decent shots and have more knowledge of the game, they get phased out basically, and it becomes a choice that you're just less and less likely to make, to grab a little turret buddy and a little drone in this variant, where, for instance, for myself, I would much prefer to be on a turret drone hybrid with negotiator or the high ends. And yeah, that is very much the case with these builds, but they are quite effective still, and for some people they will be their main builds, and that is quite fine. If well made, if well put together, they are quite effective, as I showed here to some limited extent. We did some CPs without struggling with 4 directives as well, and we did a mission, and I didn't really do too bad. And instead of some of the builds that you may see in the matchmaker, a turret drone is, when I see it on other people's, they are more reliable. You can kind of know what to expect from a turret and a drone player, as their output will be quite consistent, where, for instance, when you have tank players alongside of you, they will likely actually be less useful. Yeah, that's very much brings me to all I have had wanted to say about this build. I do recommend them, and they are on my recommended list for a reason. As, yeah, for newer players, they do, especially newer players, they do make a lot of sense. Also in how hard it is to put them together. Now, for my upcoming video, I will actually do a piece on how basically the thought process of how to put a glass red build together, how, like, the thinking behind it, and we're going to go through it in a process. It'll be a little bit rambly. It's not going to be a guide. It's going to be more of a rambling talk. And afterwards as well, I have I'm working on getting a nice graphic for where exotics availability, how that works, and that will be an in-depth guide. So yeah, those will be coming up, and I hope you enjoyed joining me for this one. And the next ones will actually be following on this one up quite fast. So yeah, I hope you join me for those. Have a good night.